Morning, everyone, and thank you, Luke, and thank you, Clive, for that welcome to country. And we'd also like to send our best wishes to Auntie Di, who I understand is not well. But we're very grateful, Clive, for you doing the welcome for us. Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country here in Melbourne and throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to their cultures, country and elders past, present and emerging, including, of course, Auntie Di and any other elders who may be with us at this conference. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us here today, and welcome. This is the largest TEXA conference so far. It's the fourth TEXA conference. We have record-breaking numbers, and certainly looking out across the breadth of this enormous room, it certainly feels that way too. We've got a very full and diverse program of experts coming to share insights and their expertise with you. We can't take all the credit for the program design. The program design is very much built around the ideas, suggestions and feedback that you gave us from last year, at last year's conference. You told us to prioritise more opportunities for questions and answers, fewer panels, varied presentation styles such as lightning talks, and I'm eager to discover those. And we were flattered, I think, that you requested more TEXA-specific updates and opportunities to ask questions of TEXA staff, and we've built into the programme plenty of opportunities for that to happen. I hope the programme speaks for itself, and as does the attendance we have today, with more than 825 delegates coming to this TEXA conference. I think the title for my introductory words this morning is The State of the Sector, and given the very many sector representatives here, I ought to clarify and specify that by saying this will be the state of the sector from the perspective of the National Higher Education Regulator. We certainly don't claim to speak for every perspective within this sector. Much as I know we're cherished by the sector, it's just possible that our particular perspectives will not be shared by all. Nevertheless, it's become something of a tradition to show at this conference our latest at-a-glance snapshot of the risk profile of the sector and what it looks like for 2019. So that gives you, that's the matrix, the famous 3x3 matrix, and it shows, I think, well, it speaks for itself really, 72 providers, low risk to financial position, low risk to both financial position and to students, and at the opposite end of the matrix, 3 providers who are both high risk in terms of students and financial position. But overall, this is a sector which is predominantly low risk, and when one adds into that the balance of where students are taught, it becomes even more the case that the overwhelming number of Australian students, over 90%, are actually taught within a low-risk institution. So that, I think, is very encouraging. The position in relation to comparison to last year, let me give the percentage picture. So that just gives you a percentage breakdown: 48% of providers low, 2% of providers high. And I think those figures, the next slide will show you how they've moved in percentage points since last year. Yes, there we go. And you see there the increase in terms of the number of providers that are 8% percentage point increase in the number of providers that are low. As I say, we'll circulate those and you can ponder them and read into them what you will. The position is generally positive and not significantly different, I think, from last year. Let me move on to perspectives. The regulator and the regulated will inevitably have different perspectives from time to time. Thank you. And on particular issues, but in fact our conference theme is one that will unite us all, as the focus for this year's conference is on how partnerships can drive quality. A continuing touchstone for us all in TEXA is the review of higher education regulation, conducted as long ago as 2013 now by Kwong Lee Dao and Valerie Braithwaite. Many of you will remember that report and the conclusions that were within it. I just wanted to pick out one point from that report because I think it expresses well the partnership theme. I mean, clearly it was a report written at a time when there was a perception of the need for TEXA to change its approach. The writers of the report wrote, the regulation of higher education providers needs to shift from regulating as an object to regulating as partners. We know it's possible to bring a better balance to the regulatory approach. Now, that was published in 2013, and I think it's fair to say that we've come a long way since then. Much of our work over the last year has supported a partnership approach. It's been a year of considerable rebuilding for TEXA after the federal budget of 2018 enabled the agency to move back towards a sustainable level of staffing and resourcing. This means we're able to work better to deliver what we do in terms of regulation for the sector and, of course, for students. And I ought to add a welcome to the very many students who are with us at the conference this week. Over the past year, we've continued to seek our stakeholders' ideas and suggestions formally through our provider survey, and some of you will have responded to that, and through forums, roundtables, and meetings with peak bodies, stakeholders in the states and territories, and individual providers, and informally in the countless interactions that there are between TEXA staff and individuals. We've listened to you, and we've helped to identify that better balance that was referred to in the report between fulfilling our regulatory responsibilities and understanding more deeply the contexts in which you and your individual institutions strive to fulfill your distinctive missions. We know that we must continue to take this approach in order to regulate what is an increasingly broad and diverse sector, and I'll be saying something about the growth of the sector in a moment. We're focused on understanding how the sector's different providers meet the standards in your varied and diverse ways. Good regulation should not only prevent failures in meeting the standards, but also, as the objects of the TEXA Act remind us, protect and enhance excellence, diversity, and innovation. Now, in doing so, in doing our work over the last year, we were delighted to be able to register 9 new providers in the sector in 2018-19. Leaders Institute, Crown Institute of Higher Education, Performing Arts Education, the Australian Chiropractic College, Adelaide Institute of Higher Education, Psychop Education and Technology, Stanley International College, Australian Campus Management, Equals International. And we've registered another 6 providers since July this year. Universal Higher Education, AIBI Higher Education, Australia Advanced Education, Australia Institute of Commerce and Management, Australian School of Accounting, Coleraine Share Trading Limited. Across all of those new members, we've accredited 27 new courses. It's the largest single period of growth in terms of new members of the higher education sector since the very beginning of TEXA. And it's an encouraging sign of that diversity and growth that I referred to a moment ago. Among those 27 new courses, no fewer than 5 broad fields of education are represented. So again, we're seeing diversity. 15 new entrants in the last 18 months. So TEXA's approach to regulation is one that seeks to support diversity and innovation, which in turn, of course, increases the number of options for students and grows our world-class higher education sector by encouraging investment while safeguarding reputation. The purpose of the additional resourcing for TEXA that I referred to earlier is to enable us to perform our statutory tasks effectively, efficiently, and in a timely way. Perhaps it's the latter point, the timeliness, which is of greatest importance to individual providers as they seek to move forward to enter the sector, introduce new courses, or recruit more international students, and make the necessary investments to do so. The fruits of the focus that we've placed on operational efficiencies are beginning to be seen. Our annual report for 2018-19, recently tabled in Parliament, contained within it some significant operational improvements, including a few that I'd like to mention today. State of the sector. In the last financial year, TEXA achieved a 24% reduction in the time taken to reach decisions on major applications, including a 48% improvement in the median time taken to assess and make decisions about applications for registration from prospective entrants, and a 49% improvement in the median time taken to assess and make decisions about applications for course accreditations for prospective entrants and registered providers. The 2018 annual report also shows a marked improvement in our ability to meet legislative timeframes. 209 out of 210 matters were addressed within the legislative timeframes of the TEXA Act. Just one preliminary assessment was late, compared with 179 out of 200 in 17-18. We're doing more as well to improve our efficiency further, and I'll say a little more about that in a moment. I think these results, and they are part of the picture, not all of the picture, but I think these results lay the foundation for continued improvements over the coming year. But we have no room for complacency, and the improvement of assessment timeframes remains the agency's #1 operational priority. Another measure of how we're seeking to fulfill our responsibilities and how our partnerships help drive improvement is the one that we get from you, and we again this year conducted our annual stakeholder survey. The survey helps us take the temperature of the sector by inviting a wide range of feedback, not only for TEXA to consider, but to use as the basis for the self-assessment that we're required to make under the regulator performance framework that goes forward after comment from the Higher Education Standards Panel to the Minister. So what did the survey tell us this year? You can see we did well in some categories. Upwards of 80% of respondents rated us as good or excellent in several areas. Importantly, in some overarching questions, about 3/4 of stakeholders rated TEXA as good or excellent in assuring the quality of higher education, Australian higher education, in relation to being open, transparent, and consistent in our dealings with stakeholders, in regards to our communications with stakeholders. Now, these are encouraging results, especially that we're communicating regulatory policy well and working with the sector to help everyone understand our role and responsibilities. But we're not remotely complacent, and we will continue to use these results as benchmarks for the coming year as we shape an action plan, as we do each year, in response to what the survey has told us about our performance. And in addition to some of those satisfying results, the survey also delivered some very clear messages about where we need to do better. We need to better communicate how we work with the entire sector, noting that universities, although they teach over 90% of the sector's students, in terms of regulated entities, are less than 1/4 of the 179 entities now on the National Register. So addressing the entire sector, working with the entire sector, was a clear message. We need to continually work on efficiency, making sure that we not only meet the legislative requirements, but that we're committed to streamlining and innovation, and the reduction, wherever it can be responsibly done, of the regulatory burden on providers. And as I say, I'll say a little more about that in a moment. And again, coming back to partnership, we need to continually look to the sector and our wider stakeholders for feedback as we develop and refine our regulatory tools and approaches. Now, talking of that process of refining regulatory tools and approaches, one of our key tools is the research assessment framework. And that is an area where we have been out to very extensive consultation over the recent period. One of our key projects was the revision of the research assessment framework, the annual risk assessment that touches every provider every year, so it's vital that it commands confidence from the sector. We had a national series of workshops to consult the sector on the future of the risk assessment framework, and that was attended by over 80% of providers. Our report on the consultation is still being compiled, but our preliminary findings indicate that providers like and affirm a number of aspects of the current risk assessment approach. You told us that generally you support the structure of the risk assessment framework and the areas of focus, in other words, the 11 indicators, broadly looking at students and looking at financial position that constitute the current framework. The approach, the general approach, is valued by providers. In other words, an annual confidential approach, a report to each provider around which there is dialogue between TEXA staff and the providers themselves. The fact that we incorporate qualitative information and context, and that providers have an opportunity to respond to the risk assessments as they are being developed. On the other hand, you also highlighted a number of areas for potential change, and we'll be considering these very seriously. Concerns were raised about the graduate destinations indicator. Our focus on full-time employment or study post-graduation is felt to be too narrow, and providers noted that the government's graduate success measure in the proposed performance-based funding scheme could conceivably be an alternative approach. What providers seem to like about that proposal is that it takes context very much into account. Lagging data. We're sometimes in the risk assessments using data that's 2 years old. But we are out to consultation with the department. We have been out to consultation with the department about the national data collection to try to ensure that data is available to us in terms of the risk assessment sooner. There's no doubt that the sector would prefer adjusted attrition to be utilised rather than raw attrition, noting that that's not possible in the absence at the moment of a unique student identifier. And in that context, it was very good to see the government's commitment to a USI for all HE students in the 2019 budget. And finally, the sector would like to see benchmarks used. In other words, where does a provider sit, not simply in relation to absolute risk indicators, but in relation to their peers? So that was another clear message. Now, there was a split in terms of the consultation on whether TEXA should publish risk data. In other words, the thresholds and the quantitative values that are used against each risk indicator per provider. Some said yes, full transparency. Others were equally very resistant to the idea of publication, feeling that it would harm that confidential exchange between the provider and TEXA that currently takes place. So a mixed verdict there. We're currently considering the feedback. We look forward to sharing the report and its findings with everyone early next year, and to moving forward with recommendations to our Commission and then to the sector to take the risk assessment framework forward. We've also consulted widely on our growing number of guidance notes, and you see them up on the screen there, a total now of 28 guidance notes. The primary purpose of the notes is to offer guidance to providers on how TEXA is likely to address a particular subject for regulatory purposes. Now, it's clear from the provider survey that I mentioned a moment ago that the guidance notes are greatly valued by many. And I know from conversations with providers and peak bodies that there are, despite that enthusiasm for guidance, there are some concerns about their status. Are the guidance notes becoming a prescriptive extension of the standards themselves? It's very important, I think, therefore, for me to say that we do not intend them in that way. The guidance notes are intended to provide guidance and advice only, and are certainly not definitive, binding, or prescriptive documents. We're adding text to the guidance notes to make that absolutely clear. That is clear also internally with TEXA staff in terms of the position of the guidance notes. And we feel that with those safeguards, we continue to provide what most providers find extremely helpful, particularly providers who are perhaps newer to the sector and are looking for signposts as to the way forward in terms of in terms of meeting the higher education standards framework. The guidance notes are all available on our website. Do have a look if you haven't done so, and they are constantly growing. So, to the matter immediately at hand, our 4th annual conference. Over the course of the next few days, the TEXA team and I are looking forward to sharing in more detail with you our updated plans. In particular, we will be sharing some of the work that we're doing in relation to sector-wide matters, including 4 that I'd now briefly like to mention. The first is the work around promoting academic integrity and addressing contract cheating. Breaches of academic integrity, as we know, can undermine Australia's world-class higher education system and its reputation. We're supporting providers to create institutional responses to such breaches and to promote and protect cultures of academic integrity. We've received very positive feedback, thank you, from the recent national programme of workshops, which have been extraordinarily well attended. And we know many of you, or colleagues back in your institutions, will have attended them and found them valuable. The workshops have been focused on supporting providers to strengthen institutional detection, prevention and responses to breaches of academic integrity. And I'd like to thank Associate Professor Tracy Brettag from UniSA, Dr. Guy Curtis, UWA, Dr. Christine Slade, University of Queensland, and Dr. Margaret McNeil from the International College of Management, Sydney, for the hard work that they've put in making those workshops such a success. We've several academic integrity experts with us here to share their research and insights. Do seek them out during the networking opportunities. There is more to come from us, from TEXA, on academic integrity and specifically on contract cheating. Many of you will have seen, and many of you also commented on, the exposure draft of the planned federal legislation, which is intended to make the provision of contract cheating services illegal. TEXA has consistently supported the introduction of such legislation. Encouraged by the example of New Zealand, it sends a strong signal about the unacceptability of what is in effect organised academic corruption. Now, certainly we, and I know the government, have heard the signal that was sent in that feedback about concerns that the legislation might be used in some way to pursue individuals. There were even quite dramatic evocations of innocent mums and dads and other close relatives being prosecuted for helping their offspring with assessments. TEXA has neither the resources nor the intention to approach the problem in this way. So let me reassure you on that front. We do think that showing a determined response to a problem which affects all higher education systems should include the use of intelligence shared between the regulator and providers, and by regulators across national boundaries, which is why it's so encouraging to have so many colleagues from international regulatory agencies and quality assurance bodies with us here at this conference. Individual providers can take action to close off the opportunities which are flagrantly advertised. You frequently see posters along Collins Street inviting people to get in touch with services that will provide everything from individual essays to full PhD theses. It's very flagrant. We've noted the degree of success our colleagues in the UK's Quality Assurance Agency have had in persuading big IT and social media companies to remove platforms for some of these services, and again the legislation will be helpful in that respect. We'll keep talking particularly to the DVC Academic Network of Universities Australia, with whom we're working closely on this, and with other peak bodies representing all parts of the sector, with researchers and regulatory agencies as we seek to tackle this problem in partnership. But our focus is on support, intelligence and the spreading of good practice, not in seeking to apply punitive regulatory sanctions to providers who are doing their best to tackle an insidious and often, as we know, very technologically sophisticated problem. I look forward to Associate Professor Kath Ellis's presentation on contract cheating tomorrow afternoon. The second matter is our continuing work with the sector in addressing sexual assault and sexual harassment. TEXA's work in this difficult and challenging area has focused on three main approaches. First, we, at the request of the then Minister, Senator Simon Birmingham, produced a summary report of responses from the sector to the Change the Course report from the Australian Human Rights Commission. We delivered that report to his successor, Minister Dan Tehan, in January this year. By the way, I ought to say that TEXA in this space acknowledges the really important leadership role that's been played by Universities Australia through its Respect Now Always campaign in relation to the AHRC report and indeed to the new survey which UA has commissioned, we understand, from the Social Research Centre and which is going to run next year. Back to TEXA, Secondly, we've included provider responses to sexual assault and sexual harassment in our re-registrations, working with each provider to review and improve their ability to prevent and respond to sexual assault and harassment. Third, we've continued to investigate individual cases that have been brought to our attention by students or by their advocates, where they believe that provider policies and procedures have failed in some way. It's important to stress that TEXA doesn't seek to second-guess or rerun providers' own procedures, but we do look to see if the alleged shortcomings constitute a failure of the duty to maintain well-being and safety of students that are very clearly laid out in the higher education standards. Plus, the other dimension we commonly look at is whether the processes to resolve the complaints about SASH issues have resolved them fairly, as per the requirement, again, of the standards. Finally, in this area, I can say that we're working towards a good practice note, which will aim to support higher education providers to better understand, prevent, identify, and respond to sexual assault and sexual harassment. We're taking advice from experts in the area and from providers themselves, of course, and we will include guidance on good practice in providers' complaint handling and disciplinary procedures, including support and assistance for the complainant and the alleged perpetrator. And contrary to what you may have read in the media, our advice will continue to be consistent with previous guidance on well-being and safety and grievance and complaints handling that TEXA has published on the importance for providers of distinguishing those serious matters that need to be referred to the police and the criminal justice system. Like our other good practice notes, this one will offer practical advice. There will be named examples of good practice to guide operations in regard to this specific issue. Third big sector-wide issue I wanted to mention was the question of the use of assessments of English language competency in the admission of international students. There's been significant media coverage of this issue and suggestions of a widespread failure on the part of the sector to maintain entry standards which will ensure that all overseas students are able to fully participate and succeed in Australian higher education. TEXA does not hold the view or see the evidence for this picture of widespread failure. International students as a whole have higher rates of progression and lower rates of attrition than domestic students. And there is a slide, I think, which says something about that. I'll see if it comes up. But we do have some concerns. First, it's not easy to get a clear picture in prisms of what exactly those students admitted with other English language qualifications, often between 40 and 60% of all those admitted, have actually achieved. So we welcome more granularity in prisms to provide reassurance as to what actually lies under that heading. Second, are providers sure that waivers of the English language requirement have been justified by subsequent student performance? We're looking to see some analysis of student entry and subsequent progression for different types of conditions. If you've issued waivers, are you sure that the students who have had waivers are then progressing successfully? Third, we will of course respond very positively to Minister Tian's request that we produce a good practice note for providers with real examples, again named examples from named institutions, of what is working well as we see good practice across the sector. The fourth sector-wide issue I wanted to mention was admissions transparency. Now, TEXA exists to safeguard student interests. That's very clear from the objects of the Act. This project on admissions transparency was initiated by then Minister Birmingham in February 2016. It was intended to be instrumental in helping students to make informed choices about their higher education. Great work and very rapid progress was coordinated across the sector by the implementation group chaired by Professor Kerry-Lee Krause, with the introduction of agreed templates, common terminology, and clearer approaches to signposting the diverse routes by which students now approach higher education. That work was done in the second half of 2017. At TEXA, our role has been to provide guidance and support and monitoring to the sector. As planned, in the original scheme of implementation. We're now looking at what has been achieved over 2 years later and beginning to prepare a summative evaluation report and recommendations for the Minister, which are scheduled to be delivered to him in March next year. We've begun an early look at what's going on in the space of admissions transparency since the initial implementation. And it's a mixed picture, I think it's true to say. Some providers are yet to present or locate their admissions information in ways that are easily accessible to prospective students. Some providers have implemented the majority of the actions that were called for, but still have at least, in many cases, one substantial change still required, whether that be outdated ATAR or student profiles or inconsistent information. There are providers who are yet to implement some of the actions that were due to be implemented back in 2017. So we'll continue to work in a supportive way with providers in this area. I hope the summative report that we produce early next year will be helpful. And if we have particular concerns about particular providers, obviously we'll be in touch with you about that in terms of moving forward to a rather fuller implementation of admissions transparency than I think is visible at the moment. So we look forward to 2020 and to an extraordinarily busy policy agenda, not only for TEQSA, of course, but for the higher education sector as a whole. TEQSA will be engaging with the results of major reviews of the provider categories that are embedded in the higher education standards framework, with proposals for simplification of the university categories, the creation of new categories for other higher education providers. And I just wanted to say, and some of you will have been present yesterday afternoon when we had an excellent workshop conducted by Ian O'Connor and Kerry Lee Krause of the Higher Education Standards Panel on the subject of provider categories. The review of the Australian qualifications framework with proposals on how the framework might relate in future to the rapid and widespread development of micro-credentials, which has been an issue that we're particularly engaged with internally at TEQSA. Codes now published for providers responding to foreign interference. The French code, of course, published in relation to freedom of speech on campus. They all have areas and extend beyond those matters which are strictly the remit of TEQSA, but they all touch on TEQSA's remit in some way and to differing extents. We look forward to hearing from Minister Tehan on this strong policy agenda when he addresses us here at this conference on Friday morning. Through these policy changes, TEQSA will work in partnership with our colleagues in the Department of Education and Government, with providers and with students to provide a regulatory framework that can continue to secure the reputation for excellence enjoyed by Australia's sector worldwide, while ensuring, as I mentioned earlier, that there is plenty of room and encouragement for innovation and diversity. But I wanted to come back to that, what I said was the key operational objective of TEQSA over the coming year. The central focus of our work in 2020 will be managing the increased workload. Now, we're beginning the second cycle of TEQSA's activity. TEQSA is 7 years old. Some of you may remember its birth. Some of you may have been present at its birth. We're now beginning the second 7-year cycle. And so, as you can easily calculate, we are facing a record number of re-registrations and re-accreditations as 7-year periods of approval come to an end. We want to ensure continued timeliness, improvement in the timeliness of decision-making while maintaining our oversight of the sector. So let me take the opportunity very briefly to list a few of our key initiatives to further enhance our operational efficiency. Where a provider has an established track record of low-risk, high-quality delivery, either across their operations or with respect to one or more courses, TEQSA will consider extending the provider's registration or course accreditation, in accordance with the policy which has been adopted by the Commission of extensions to the period of provider registration or course accreditation. We're currently looking, where appropriate, to reduce the scope of the core. Some of you may be familiar with the term Core Plus. We're now looking also at Core Minus. This means that for providers who are found to be consistently low risk, we would further reduce the number of standards assessed by TEQSA during a re-registration and place further weight on a provider's capability for self-assurance. We still have Core Plus, of course. Under the Core Plus model, registered providers are required to submit minimum evidence relating to a set of core standards in the standards framework, with their applications. Some providers are then required to submit additional evidence against other selected standards on a case-by-case basis, according to risk profile and regulatory track record. We're going to extend the Core Plus approach to all providers for Cycle 2 for re-registrations, re-accreditations and accreditations on a case-by-case basis. But again, making that judgment where we can look at a core plus, if necessary, some additional elements rather than looking across the whole scope of the higher education standards. We're initiating a project to reschedule sector assessment activities with the aim of smoothing peaks and troughs that currently exist due to the cyclical nature of TECSA's assessment work. Leaving the current peak assessment cycle unaddressed presents significant challenges for us in delivering timely outcomes. If in 1 year you're dealing with 300 assessments and the next year you're dealing with 600, then clearly, in operational terms, that is an enormous challenge. We want to smooth that and give ourselves maximum opportunity to give the attention required properly for each assessment and to do that in a timely way. So smoothing of that cycle is proposed as a one-time adjustment to balance our renewal workload over the next 7 years and ensure that Cycle 2 and the following Cycle 3 is more evenly distributed in terms of volume and risk profile perspective. We're encouraging all providers to conduct their own comprehensive review of courses, which of course is good practice anyway, including using independent external subject matter experts. This is in line with the focus of the higher education standards on providers' monitoring, review and improvement processes. So again, increasingly trying to place reliance wherever we can on what providers have already done and what providers have already engaged in terms of their own external advice. Decisions for accreditation and re-accreditation may be made by TECSA without the need for a review by a TECSA external expert if we're satisfied that the provider has conducted a comprehensive review of the course that includes a sufficient independent external input and subject matter expertise. Finally, we're undertaking a number of projects internally to streamline and improve our business processes to deliver more timely decisions and to improve engagement with providers. This includes, it's not limited to, but it includes a lean process review and a review of our case management model. So, several significant improvements in information and knowledge management are already underway. We look forward to their full implementation. They will complement, I think, the drive towards greater operational efficiency, which I've mentioned. I'm conscious of time and that I stand between you and George Megalogenis, a speaker whose stratospheric approval ratings from last year's conference are truly intimidating for any speaker that has to precede him. There are going to be ample opportunities with members of the TECSA team to discuss the issues that I've covered today in more depth over the coming days. I just wanted to conclude with a few thank yous. I'm delighted to welcome so many international partners. We had a list from Luke. I won't read the list again, but it's impressive. And I particularly wish to welcome those international regulatory partners with whom we'll be signing memoranda of understanding during the course of this conference. Thank you for travelling to be with us, and a warm welcome to you all. Thank you all to joining us for what I hope is going to be a stimulating and rewarding 3 days. And thank you particularly for your continuing partnership in sustaining and enhancing quality. Thank you.